kind of school is this anyway?
I can handle things, I'm smart!
But have you considered that he might just be that good? Not this good.
Welcome to the MrIQ podcast. Here's your host, Chip Franklin.
So the Earth is pretty big, 24,000 miles at the equator, and it seems even bigger when you're stuck in traffic. So the idea that people so small you can't even see us from airplanes could possibly have an effect on the climate or the atmosphere seemed pretty far-fetched, right? We were incapable of changing the Earth, or so we thought. Then came the ozone layer. F. Sherwood Rowland was a professor of chemistry at the University of California, and he had shown that chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, could destroy ozone, which is a molecule made up of 3 oxygen atoms up in the Earth's atmosphere. The stratospheric ozone absorbs ultraviolet radiation that otherwise would reach the surface of the Earth. Now, at the time, CFCs were in wide use in refrigerators and air conditioning and aerosol spray cans. The compounds, though, are essentially non-toxic and made them perfect for these applications. Now, these same characteristics, however, also made them a danger to us and to life on Earth. By the early 1970s, CFCs were in widespread use, and the production of the compounds had reached 1 million tons per year worldwide. So the scientific community was receiving quite a bit of pushback, as you can imagine, from industries who greatly relied on its production. In 1985, British scientists changed the way the world viewed the crisis, however, when they published an article in Nature that revealed the stratospheric ozone over Antarctica had been reduced by 40%. And that's really significant. See, because ozone is a natural sunscreen. It absorbs and blocks the majority of the sun's UV radiation. Without ozone, all of the radiation would reach Earth, damaging the DNA of plants and animals and humans. Without plants, the food chain would collapse, and the rest isn't very good. Humans, for the first time, realized their actions could affect the environment on a planetary scale. The other climate crisis that we're experiencing today has been predicted for nearly a century. The idea that carbon in the atmosphere can trap the Earth's heat and cause the polar caps to melt and the ocean levels to rise. And with that, an assorted array of very problematic consequences. You might remember An Inconvenient Truth. It's a 2006 documentary film starring Al Gore, the former vice president, and it chronicles his crusade to alert the public to an increasing planetary emergency due to global warming.
The assumption is something like this: the Earth is so big, we can't possibly have any lasting harmful impact on the Earth's environment. And maybe that was true at one time, but it's not anymore. And one of the reasons it's not true anymore is that the most vulnerable part of the Earth's ecological system is the atmosphere. Vulnerable because it's so thin. My friend, the late Carl Sagan, used to say, if you had a big globe with a coat of varnish on it, the thickness of that varnish relative to that globe is pretty much the same as the thickness of the Earth's atmosphere compared to the Earth itself. And it's thin enough that we are capable of changing its composition. That brings up the basic science of global warming, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because you know it well. The sun's radiation comes in the form of light waves, and that heats up the Earth, and then some of the radiation that is absorbed and warms the Earth is re-radiated back into space in the form of infrared radiation. And some of the outgoing infrared radiation is trapped by this layer of atmosphere and held inside the atmosphere. And that's a good thing because it keeps the temperature of the Earth within certain boundaries, keeps it relatively constant and livable. But the problem is this thin layer of atmosphere is being thickened by all of the global warming pollution that's being put up there. And what that does is it thickens this layer of atmosphere. More of the outgoing infrared is trapped.
Michael Mann is an atmospheric scientist at Penn State. He's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a recipient of the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement, which is basically the Nobel Prize for environmental research. His latest book is The New Climate War, and it's very good and very frightening. Michael, thanks for your time. Let's start off with a simple question. What's the greatest obstacle we face in getting the world to respond to this crisis?
You know, the premise of the book is that, no longer is our main challenge acceptance of the scientific evidence, because it's just plain as daylight now. It's too obvious to the person on the street for anybody to credibly deny. So we're sort of past outright denial of climate change. But we do have these other obstacles. Perhaps the most significant of them, in my view, is this idea that it's too late to do anything about the problem, that we're sort of past the point of no return and we might as well give up, because that's just as disabling as outright denial.
Sure.
It doesn't matter whether you deny the reality of the problem or the ability to do anything about it. It leads you down that same path of inaction. And so in my view, the sort of the doomism and this idea that it's too late to act is probably the primary obstacle we face at this point.
Obviously, when the IPCC came out and we found that 97% of scientists said, yeah, there's a problem and a man is contributing to it. Trying to explain this to people, when you have James Inhofe, the senator, coming into the Senate chamber with a snowball talking about climate change, you realize what you're dealing with, right? And then you have corporations who benefit from, whether it's drilling or, the transportation of these non-renewable sources and the environmental problems those create. They obviously didn't want anything to do with this as well, which meant that politicians were staying away from it. And, as you start in your book saying this is long predates Al Gore. This goes way back. There have been people talking about this for a long time. When did this first start to happen? Was the Industrial Revolution really the catalyst?
Yeah, and climate change, of course, is just part of an array of environmental challenges that we face today. But the climate crisis, there's no question about it. It is tied specifically to the burning of fossil fuels and therefore really to the Industrial Revolution. And that's where we see climate change emerge. That's when we see temperatures start to spike up. And in fact, I'm perhaps best known for the so-called hockey stick curve that my co-authors and I published 2 decades ago, which shows how temperatures have spiked up over the last century and a half as we have been increasing the concentration of carbon pollution in the atmosphere through fossil fuel burning in particular.
I mean, yeah, we can go back 800,000 years and see where the amount of carbon in the atmosphere was pretty flat until a period of time. And as you mentioned, your hockey stick curve, that jump, and that coincides with the buildup and the beginning, the slow beginnings of the loss of ice at both of the North and South poles, creating brackish water and freshwater areas. I think the hardest thing for most people to understand here is how this is going to affect not just them, but their kids, their grandkids, because we've seen models before in the past that were off, right? And so people point to those. They love to do that. Inhofe and this guy, Mark Morano, and some of these other guys that have a vested interest, financial interest in denying this. In your opinion, how can we actually see them and point to them and say this will lead to that? Yeah,
and in fact, the reality is that in many respects, climate scientists like myself, the climate models that we've used to project into the future have been too conservative. So we're now seeing things play out in real time that are ahead of where we expected them to be. The critics, the Inhofes and the Moranos of the world would like you to think that uncertainty in the science is a reason for inaction, is a cause not to do anything. But it's just the opposite. If anything, we have underestimated the rate at which many of these changes are taking place, the rate at which the ice sheets are now beginning to collapse, contributing to sea level rise earlier than we expected. The extreme weather events that we're seeing around the world that really go beyond what our models predicted we would be seeing at this point. So if anything, we've been too conservative. Climate scientists and climate models have been too conservative. So the bad news is when it becomes as obvious as it is now, when we can see the impacts of climate change play out in real time in the form of unprecedented heat waves and wildfires and superstorms and floods, that it's the veritable tip of the iceberg, right? It means that we've already baked in far more warming and climate change than we ever should have allowed to happen. The good news is there's still time to take actions that will prevent us from warming the planet beyond the point where we really do start to see the most dangerous and irreversible impacts.
In the process of explaining this to people, we kind of went from global warming to climate change for a lot of different reasons. What was the real reason for changing the emphasis from, the Earth is warming up to like this, there's something changing that's going to affect us in a much broader way?
Yeah, there's a little bit of irony in that because Frank Luntz, who was a Republican pollster, once, and it was widely one of the talking points that emerged from his focus groups. He had been studying sort of the language that politicians use to describe this phenomenon, and he actually advocated that Republicans and fossil fuel interests who want to sort of quell the public use climate change rather than global warming. He said climate change sounds less dangerous. Less dangerous than global warming. So as it turns out, scientists have also evolved over the last couple decades. Rather than talking about global warming, we use the term climate change. So you might ask, are we doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry and Republicans by using the term climate change, which they say is less scary to the public? No, scientists use the terminology that's appropriate and recognize global warming is just one attribute of a larger phenomenon we call climate change, because not just is the planet warming up as we continue to pump carbon pollution into the atmosphere, but the ice sheets are melting, sea level is rising, rainfall and drought patterns are shifting, more extreme weather events, more damaging hurricanes, extreme weather events like wildfires and floods. So there are all of these attributes that collectively comprise what we call climate change, and global warming, the warming of the surface, is just one of those attributes. So it's a more comprehensive description, and that's why scientists like myself, we prefer to use the term climate change. But it's just the opposite of what the critics claim. The critics say, they changed their language because they want to scare the public. No, if anything, the language that we've adopted is, according to Republican pollsters, less scary to the public, but we still use climate change because it's the correct scientific description. That having been said, I'll add one more point. In some contexts, when we're talking about the impacts and the threat and the risks, increasingly you do hear climate communicators and climate scientists refer to the climate crisis, the climate emergency. That's the threat and the risks associated with climate change. But the scientific phenomenon, that's climate change.
Yeah, it fascinates me when you go through and try to explain to people, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here. I've read just enough to be dangerous, but I remember reading where like for 5 or 6 days in a row, it was actually warmer in Louisville, Kentucky in January than it was in Juneau, Alaska. And that can't be right. The point is, it's like people were explaining about a thing called a polar vortex. How is that an indication that there's a severe climate crisis going on right now?
Yeah, so the polar vortex is this pattern that is part of the climate system. It's not created by climate change. You tend to have this band of very strong westerly winds from the west. We feel them blowing across the United States in the winter as the jet stream crosses from California to New York. And so weather patterns travel from west to east. And that's associated with a very strong band of winds that encircles the planet. And it's associated with a sort of pattern in the atmosphere where there's high pressure in the Arctic and there's low atmospheric pressure near the surface in mid-latitudes, and the winds follow those pressure contours around, and it creates that very strong band of westerly winds I talked about. And those strong winds sort of confine the cold air, or tend to confine the cold air to the Arctic. They sort of keep it bottled up. The stronger those winds, the stronger the cold air is bottled up. Well, one thing that global warming and climate change is doing, it's melting the sea ice in the Arctic. It's warming the Arctic faster than the rest of the planet. You melt away ice, the Arctic Ocean can absorb more sunlight, so it warms up even faster. It's a vicious cycle, and it leads to more warming in the Arctic than over the rest of the planet. Well, that actually decreases the temperature contrast from the cold Arctic to the warmer subtropics. The less that temperature contrast, the weaker the winds. The weaker the winds, the less able they are to bottle up the cold air. So ironically, as the Arctic warms up faster than the rest of the planet, that sort of bottleneck begins to collapse, and it's easier for those very frigid cold air masses in the Arctic to every once in a while just sort of fall down into North America because they're no longer confined by that strong vortex. The jet stream is much more wobbly, and those air masses are much more likely to leak out into where we live in the mid latitudes.
I saw an illustration that showed it like a V, the letter V. It dropped all the way down. So, to the left or right of the V, the temperatures appeared to be normal. But at the bottom of that V, which happened in Louisville, Kentucky, when Louisville was actually colder than, parts of Alaska. And I saw that and I thought to myself, that's kind of, your explanation was great, but it's still difficult for people to really understand. I talked to a climatologist not long ago, and we were talking about the equator and what he really worries about, that sometime in the next century or maybe less, the equator is just going to be uninhabitable. It'll be so hot there that people will have to migrate, and that will create a dangerous economic and political situations around the world. Explain how that might occur and what timetable are we talking about?
No, that's right. And so the reality is that even though the Arctic is warming faster than the subtropics and the tropics are already really warm. So even a little bit of warming of the tropics starts to put temperatures really in the danger zone. Once you get into sort of perpetual temperatures in the high 80s, dew point temperatures in the high 80s, low 90s, where it's that combination of heat and humidity that makes it so uncomfortable and so difficult for us. Pretty soon, the tropics essentially become uninhabitable. They're just too hot for human habitation. And if you look at the climate model predictions, with business as usual, if we don't do anything about the problem, just sort of continue headlong burning of fossil fuels, by later this century, it's a reasonable expectation that, a better part of half of the land surface of the planet is uninhabitable. It's just too hot. Or in subtropical regions, and Australia is a great example, it's too dry and hot. That combination of hot and dry that gives you massive bushfires, or in California, the West Coast wildfires like we've seen in recent summers. So you really start to look at a situation where a larger and larger parts of the planet are essentially becoming uninhabitable, global population continuing on, 7-8 billion people competing for less space, less food, less water. If that sounds like the prescription for a post-apocalyptic Hollywood-type dystopian movie, it's because that's a possible future. It could look like the dystopian futures of Hollywood if we don't act on this problem.
As we speak right now, obviously, we're still trying to deal with SARS-CoV-2 virus, but we're hearing about the possibility of other viruses in other parts of the world, in wet markets. How much is climate change playing into that scenario?
So that's pretty speculative. There are some scientists who think that climate change is helping create the conditions that are conducive to, again, these novel diseases that have been confined to exotic animals that we rarely come into contact with. Perhaps more immediate and also a cause of climate change, deforestation, for example, the destruction of rainforests. That's contributing to carbon emissions, so it's contributing to the climate change problem, but there's a direct link between the destruction of habitats, rainforests, and the fact that some of these exotic creatures are starting to leave their comfort zone. They're more likely to come into contact with human beings. And so I think what one can say with some degree of confidence is the same environmental degradation that contributes to global warming and climate change is contributing to problems like the COVID-19 pandemic. And it speaks to the greater challenge, right? It's not just climate change. It's about us finding a way to live sustainably on this planet.
And there's probably scenarios, too, that we haven't even thought of. Obviously, you're talking about mass migrations of people, and the socioeconomic and political ramifications of that are it's hard to fathom. We saw with this past president how he dealt with people just trying to leave Central America from situations that our military had created over the last 50 years, how that was politically turned, and that could easily happen again. Let me ask you about permafrost and actually how much carbon parts per million we're dealing with now, and the fear of if the permafrost melts and what could happen.
Yeah, so this is something I talk about in the book. It's the basis for a lot of mythology, climate mythology. So, a lot of the bad science traditionally has been on sort of the right side of our political spectrum. Climate change deniers, advocating for fossil fuel interests, Republicans primarily, who, are in the pay of fossil fuel, Republican politicians who've been in the pay of fossil fuel interests. The anti-science and the myths have come in the past largely from the right side of our spectrum, but that's changed a little bit in that there's also some bad science that now fuels sort of what I alluded to before, the sort of doomism that we see coming from some environmental progressives. This idea that it's too late to do something. There's one fairly well-known climate figure, sort of a cult figure in the doomism community, who has insisted that climate change, we are already now on the path towards runaway warming. We can't do anything about it, and we and all other life on Earth will be extinct in 10 years. Well, actually, he said that like 5 years ago, so I guess it's 5 years now. And that's not helpful because for the reasons I said before, it sort of potentially leads to disengagement.
Well, let me jump in and say what I read, and you can answer that. Yeah. Well, the parts per million is what 400 something,
about 412 or so parts per million. Very seasonally, but it's
right. And 250 years ago, it was a lot less.
About 280. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So this person I read said if the permafrost should melt, so much carbon would be released that it could be in my lifetime. We could see 1,200 parts per million, which doesn't sound good at all. To me, that sounds like the end of the world. So you're saying that this permafrost that's there and the carbon that's under there, this may not be entirely accurate?
Yeah, so I'm just about to get to that exact issue. That's so these almost to a person, these doomist narratives that we encounter are almost always premised on the scenario you just described, this idea of runaway warming tied to methane that's trapped in the permafrost that will be mobilized, released with warming. Like a lot of these things, there's a grain of truth to it. And there's some evidence for a so-called feedback mechanism where you melt the permafrost, some of that methane escapes into the atmosphere. Methane's a very potent greenhouse gas, so it causes more warming. It's an amplifying factor, but there's no evidence to support the scenario that it's a runaway warming factor. And if you look at the carbon that scientists who study this, carefully, say could be released from melting permafrost over the next century, it's a fraction of the carbon that we are releasing due to fossil fuel emissions, fossil fuel burning. So we need to keep our eyes focused on the prize. The primary contributor here is the carbon we're putting into the atmosphere by fossil fuel burning. And the methane released from permafrost, there's no evidence that can compete in its impact with the warming that we're causing. It can add a little bit, and there are increasingly a number of climate models that incorporate the biology and chemistry and physics of that into the models, and they find no evidence for the sort of doomsday runaway scenarios that some climate doomists have used to sort of promote this narrative of an uninhabitable planet.
I mean, that's important, I think, that we talk about the science of this as much as we can, because obviously there's a lot of vitriol from both sides here. You must get some pushback from people on the left that don't like you saying that and writing about that, True. But again, if we're going to get Fortune 500 companies to come on board, and we've seen some of that. We've seen Exxon and Mobil and some others realizing that the future is not in non-renewable. that they have to find another way. They're not moving as fast as we'd like, but
they're kicking and screaming, but they're being moved along a little bit. Yeah,
right. Yeah, and that's through legislation, but it's mostly through science. How much has changed since the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's report that rocked the world? I think we've changed. I think that the Al Gore and Al Gore's a great guy. I don't know if you've met him before, but he's a really...
I know him, and I agree with you. He is a very good person. No question.
But good buddy of mine was his college roommate at Harvard, along with Tommy Lee Jones.
Lee Jones, yeah, absolutely.
A friend of mine, a really bright man named Bob Summerby, who was a politico from back east. So I got a chance to meet him a couple times, and I found him to be very sober and very workmanlike about his approach, right? Which I dig, because science should be like that. Yep. Science is, I'm going to tell you this. By the way, let me just throw this in real quick. We're talking to Michael Mann, professor of atmospheric science at Penn State, and his great book called The New Climate War, which we'll get to in a second. So the whole progress of this and making people understand about something that's occurring, we got to battle sunspots, we got to battle people who doubt the data. But back to the IPCC, when they released this, 97% of scientists believe that something's happening. Of course, my first instinct is like that one where they say 3 out of 4 dentists say brush your teeth. I'm like, what's the other dentist saying? What is the hardest part about making this case to the world?
Yeah, and so, there are a number of developments you've alluded to. In 1995, the IPCC, with their second assessment report, stated for the first time that there was a discernible human influence on the planet, on the climate. So in 1995, there was now a consensus among the world's scientists that we could see the impacts of climate change now playing out. You also allude to some other studies, and they vary. There's one study that says 97% of the scientists publishing in the field, concur with the consensus that climate change is real and human caused. There are other studies that show it's 100%. It depends on how you determine, what qualifies for peer-reviewed literature. Just a commentary, or does it have to be an article that was independently reviewed by scientists? And so there are different types of scientific literature, and you can use different search terms. Naomi Oreskes, who's a colleague of mine who's written quite a bit about sort of climate change denialism, The Merchants of Doubt, book that she co-authored some years ago, did a study where, she found it was every single article concurred with the consensus in the peer-reviewed literature. There are a handful, now I wouldn't really even call them publishing scientists, but there are a handful of individuals with scientific credentials who still continue to operate as essentially advocates for the fossil fuel industry. So they're not really playing the role of the impartial scientist, but really they're involved in advocacy, often paid advocacy for the fossil fuel industry. And those are some of the talking heads that you'll see on Fox News who insist that climate change is a hoax, it's not real. They're not really legitimate scientists anymore.
Sure. So, a Socratic examination of what they're saying would reveal that they're leaving a lot out, to say the least, right?
Leaving a lot out at the best, or simply leaving a lot in that's simply wrong, right. At the worst.
And we live in this era of sound bites, right? And social media has both helped and hurt the cause, right? I think helped more than anything. It allows us to see, glaciers melting and falling in, and hear stories about the change in temperatures and what that means. And especially down in Australia, the water temperature surrounding the continent is increasingly worrisome to everyone down there.
They've got tropical fish now off the coast of Sydney, Australia. It's crazy.
You call this the new climate war. War's a strong word. And obviously, we have to get people's attention. But back to the first point, or the point we made earlier about, the permafrost, we have to do it in a very strong yet empirical approach to this. And science is slow. How do we make this presentation to the world in a way that gets their attention? Can we do it economically? Is that the best way to say we're going to save you money? That seems to work most of the time.
Well, I don't think there's any one message that's ideally suited to all audiences. So to some extent, it's about sort of knowing your audience and what are the messages that are true to the science, not rhetoric, not propaganda, but what are the messages that are grounded in the science that are perhaps most relevant to the audience that I'm speaking to? And, if you're speaking to conservative audiences, you might want to talk more about the jobs. You might want to talk more about the national security implications of climate change. Climate change is now viewed by our national security community as one of the great threat multipliers.
Why?
In large part because of the conflict that it creates. When you're talking about a growing global population nearing 8 billion people competing for less food, less water, and less space, in part because of climate change, that creates conflict. The sort of conflict that we now know, it was sort of that atmosphere of competition and conflict in Syria that created the opportunity for ISIS to develop and for ISIS to recruit. They were able to seize upon that unrest in recruiting people into their organization. And so our national security community understands that. They've seen how those things have played out. They've started to connect the dots. And so you'll hear, the head of the Pentagon, 4-star generals, and the head of the Navy Pacific Command, who've come out and said, look, this is the greatest long-term security threat that we face.
That's a good point. Like the drought in Yemen has all sorts of implications all throughout the Middle East. Yeah, absolutely.
And, you can make about jobs. And I thought Joe Biden has framed it pretty effectively along those lines in the rollout of his executive actions, where first of all, the cost of climate inaction is far greater than the cost of taking action. We saw, more than $100 billion in damage in 2020 in the United States done by extreme weather events, made more extreme by climate change. We're from an economic standpoint, it's costing us much more than it would cost to do something about it. And in fact, you can argue doing something about it actually creates more jobs because fossil fuel industry jobs are increasingly automated. The Keystone Pipeline, it's a couple hundred jobs. Renewable energy deployment, we're talking the potential for thousands and thousands of jobs. And so let's talk about jobs, but let's make it an accurate conversation, because if we do, I think it becomes clear pretty quickly that whether it's an economic argument or a security argument, regardless of the direction you come at it, it just makes so much more sense to act on the problem than to ignore it.
I look back at the Treaty of Versailles and how it precipitated World War I, and we learned from that and instituted the Marshall Plan. And now our two closest allies, are Japan and Germany. We dropped the ball in Afghanistan, and look what happened. Al-Qaeda went in there, created a training area, and they attacked the United States and probably cost us $5 trillion since 9/11. So you're right. There are opportunities here, and that's a great way to put it. Look, this is a horrible climate crisis. However, there is an opportunity hidden in here. And you're right. That's the best way to explain it to the right. My question, and this is ironic.
Let me actually just jump in there for a second and we'll come back, because I just wanted to say, you mentioned the Marshall Plan, and that was music to my ears because I have an op-ed coming out in USA Today tomorrow.
Wow.
Using that exact framing, the war framing. And if we're going to use the war framing, then let's talk about the Marshall Plan and how this is actually an opportunity to rebuild communities and make sure that that those who have been most victimized by the transition, this necessary transition from fossil fuels, and frontline communities impacted by climate change, that they're not left behind and that they don't bear the brunt of it. And so we have to bring everybody along. And I think we can frame that in terms of something very much like the Marshall Plan.
I had an economics professor who used to say, the only time you're going to ever be wrong is when you think you're encountering something that's never happened before, because it's happened before. And there's something you can look backwards and learn from that. So that's why you frame the book in a war, the ideas behind how to win a war. Is that accurate?
In that, it's a war not of our choosing, right? We didn't choose to be in a war, but fossil fuel interests have viewed this as one, and they've used the immense power and wealth that they have to try to poison our public discourse over this issue. And that's why that's the war. It's the war against climate action by vested interests. And we have to recognize, whether we like it or not, we're in it. If you're in a war, the worst thing you can do is somehow pretend you're not in one. You have to fight back. And the book is really about how we can fight back against the tactics that are being deployed today by the enemy, as it were.
And I would imagine, using that same analogy, there are some opportunities by helping developing nations to create alliances with them. The last 4 years has been tough. What America
got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, we have a lot of work to do. Irony doesn't always have to be tragic. We can take from some of these things and learn. And if we don't, the price of not recognize the unintended consequence can be huge. I hate to ask you to do this, but is there a timeline in your head or like a tipping point on the horizon?
Fortunately, I don't have to make this up myself. The timelines are sort of dictated by the science and the numbers. The IPCC published a special report. There are teams of scientists who sort of looked at the question of how quickly do we need to reduce carbon emissions to remain within our carbon budget for avoiding certain warming targets, like 1.5 degrees Celsius. If we go beyond that, a lot of bad things really start to happen. So we might reasonably agree we don't want to pass that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold, and we're already at like 1.1, 1.2.
Wow.
So we're pretty close. It means we've got a pretty small budget. And if you do the calculation, we have to bring our carbon emissions down globally by a factor of 2 within the next 10 years. It's a monumental challenge, but it's doable. And so you ask, what's the single most important thing, say, that the Biden administration can do? I would say the single most important thing that they could have done was to signal at the very beginning that they are serious, that they see this as a crisis, that they view this, in the context of wartime footing. And that's how they are, that's how they're framing the issue, using every tool at their disposal within the executive branch to act on climate. And the most important of those tools, in my view, and you've already alluded to this, is sort of international diplomacy. The message we send to the rest of the world, because there's been some real damage there, as you allude to, over the last 4 years. We've got to rebuild that trust. The Biden administration early on is I would say going a long way towards doing that through the appointments they've made. John Kerry as the international climate czar, the special envoy on climate, sending a signal to the rest of the world that we're serious, we're ready to help lead, and we want to reestablish our relations with other countries in this effort.
Mark Twain once said the U.S.'s greatest defenses are the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, but I think 9/11 proved that doesn't exist anymore. Pandemics have proved that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, everybody's trying to figure out what they can do, right? I mean, I don't eat meat. I know that helps a little bit. I see somebody walking down the street in a pandemic. I pull up my mask and I wave. To show that we're simpatico and symbiotic, whatever, right?
Both.
Right.
We are all symbiotic on this planet, trying to live together sustainably. Yeah.
Let's say you wrote a book in 20 years. What would you hope the title would be?
How we won the climate war. And that's really the purpose of this book, is to lay out the strategy for doing that, because we're so close. We really are so close. And the events of the last couple weeks with the incoming of the Biden administration have really demonstrated that. We are so close to meeting the challenge, but there's still these obstacles in the way. And the purpose of this book is to help people recognize those obstacles, because in some ways they're more insidious. They're not as obvious. It isn't like the war on the science, attacks on the basic scientific evidence, the dismissal of climate change as a hoax. That's not what the forces of inaction, what I call the inactivists, fossil fuel interests and those doing their bidding, that's not what they're doing. They're instead trying to, they've got other tactics, doom and gloom. It's too late to do anything, so why bother? Doomsaying as a way of sort of disengaging us from action.
You have to be that way. I have kids, and they're in their 30s, and and they're pretty hard on us, my generation.
And inappropriately, right? We created this problem, and we're if we don't act now, we're going to leave it in their laps.
That's Michael Mann, The New Climate War. Michael, amazing book. Stay well, my friend.
Thank you so much. It means a lot.
You've been listening to the MrIQ podcast with Chip Franklin. To hear more, go to MrIQ.com or wherever you download your podcasts.